So, hi, my name's Alex Marsden. Good morning. So we're going to talk for about 20 minutes this morning about environmental economics, and then there's an opportunity to take questions. I think some people have submitted questions via the sort of pre-registration and that sort of thing, but feel free to put questions onto the chat. So the presentation will be available on the web after the event. And one of the things that people should be aware is that it is being recorded, but including the question and answer, but the question and answer section won't be published. We will email you a link for when we actually get started, once it's actually up on the web. And then we'll, and so that should be available after the talk, and then you can go back and have a look at it and those sorts of elements. So yeah, the overall process will be in the Q&A, we'll be able to raise your hand or that sort of thing, and then you'll be able to we'll have some questions that we had before. So just before we start the presentation, I would give an acknowledgement to country. So Marsden Jacob Associates acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia where we conduct our business. I'm based in Western Australia, so I'm in Noongar country, but we have attendees from across Australia. We also pay our respects to the ancestors and elders past, present, and leaders who are emerging. Clearly, as we're involved in environmental economics, and that includes social values and those sorts of things, our traditional owners and their values are particularly important to the work we do. Alrighty, so we'll get started. So this is part of our Marsden Jacob Talks Live series. This is our third talk in the series. Just before we get to the Q&A, I will talk about the next one, which I believe is in early August. This is a little bit about myself. So I was once an environmental engineer, so I was one of the first graduates in environmental engineering in the mid to late 90s. And since then I did a Master's in Business Administration, and I also did some competition policy while I was working in London. I've got 25 years experience in policy and regulatory reform. And one of the key things that we look at is the effectiveness and efficiency of current arrangements, and then also what they could be in the future, or what alternative structures would look like. And we also do a fair bit around, we do a lot around regulation and policy, but we also do it around infrastructure and those sorts of elements. So we have used, we've done a large number of regulation impact statements or regulatory impact statements, depending on which state and territory you live in. And one of the ones that we'll talk about today is the ratification of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. So that's an international convention, and we'll talk about that shortly. We also do a fair bit of work around assessing projects on both a commercial feasibility basis, but also on a feasibility basis. And so we look at cost benefit analysis and other economic tools like that. And so we have to look at the total benefit to society, and often that's sort of the triple bottom line. Financial, but also environmental, and then also social benefits and costs. So the flow of the talk today that we'll cover is set out there. So we're going to start off with why this topic and why now, and then we'll move through, and you should be able to spot as the dots move across the board. So why this topic and why now? And the reality is that across Australia, there's a lot of government departments, and pretty much every government department has a reform package or a series of reforms that they would like to progress, but they can't. Often this is due to things like low drafting priority, or it's stored at the Minister's office, or things like that. And it's quite important to, if the departments are going to be given the tools that they feel they require, that they can actually progress and either put to bed and not progress, or go ahead with policy reform and regulatory reform. Regulation impact statements are a standard sort of approach, or regulatory impact statements, or RISs, as they're often shortened to, are a standard approach to ensure that legislation aligns with better regulation principles. And that's about making sure that the legislation is targeted, that it's not excessive red tape, that that they are reviewed regularly, and they're effective. RISs are often seen by government departments as an additional hurdle to jump through, and as almost a government red tape. So to stop, it's often seen as stopping government from actually getting their policy packages forwards. Whereas in reality, it can be used to promote the reform and ensure that it gets implemented. And so in many ways, what we're talking about today is not seeing this as just something that has to be done, but seeing as there's something that can actually help your reforms go ahead, and making sure that you make the most of the opportunities you're given. The reality is also that industry is very good at estimating the costs of red tape. And government departments need to get better at estimating the benefits, and often they're non-market benefits. So they are things that you can't go out and buy, but they're things that everyone values. And so a clean environment, a lack of pollution, amenity, health and safety, these are all things that the community values quite highly, but we can't go out and buy. And so we refer to those as non-market benefits. So we'll talk next about the purpose and importance of RISs. So in each state and territory, there is a requirement for a regulation impact statement or regulatory impact statement before proposed laws are progressed. Yeah, the overall aim, as we said, aligns with better regulation principles and to cut down on red tape. And so make sure that you've thought about all the alternative approaches, including non-regulatory approaches, market approaches, or relying on industry to behave better. And you can have co-regulatory approaches, which is where industry proposes a way forwards, and then but can actually a code of practice or that sort of thing that can be enforceable. It also, the aim is to ensure that any increase in costs to government or to industry, and industry costs are often referred to as red tape, are carefully considered. Regulatory burden is a phrase that gets used in the analysis as well. The other thing is to make sure that stakeholders are consulted, and so that all the stakeholder groups are actually identified, they've all been considered, and that it's all going well. And the other thing is but the key thing is I'm not going to go through the RIS guidance. I'm not going to repeat the bits that are sort of clearly written. I actually think the OBPR, which is the Office of Best Practice Regulation, which is the Commonwealth RIS body, they provide really helpful guidance, and have a look at those. The 7 questions that they set out for RISs and those sorts of elements, I think are a great way of looking at it, and it's a great way of thinking about RISs. Even if you're looking at delivering a RIS for a state government, often the Commonwealth guidance is quite helpful as well. So one of the case studies I'll refer to today is the Minamata Convention. So the Minamata Convention is an international convention which aims to phase down the use of mercury. The convention was written in 2013, and Australia was a key contributor to the drafting of the actual convention. So we were a signatory to the convention in 2013, and the way that the convention was written was that it came into force and was legally enforceable for parties that had ratified it once 50 countries had ratified it. That occurred in 2017, in August of 2017. And originally, Australia had hoped to be one of the early groups ratifying it, given that they had contributed to the writing of it. So we were actually recruited or commissioned by the Commonwealth Environmental Department, which has changed names across at this time, but it's currently the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. And so we actually looked at the ratification and did a cost-benefit analysis on it in 2015. In late 2017 and early 2018, we were asked to do that again. And then we did it a third time in 2020. And Australia ended up ratifying after the last set of analysis. And so we actually ratified in December of 2021, and we became the 136th country to ratify. So I'm not sure if you know roughly how many countries attend the Olympics or that sort of thing, but around 140 is sort of the number of countries that tend to attend the Olympics or sign on to international regulations or conventions or that sort of thing. So we were certainly towards the end of the group. So when we look at long-term reforms such as the Minamata Convention, what we are very careful about doing, and we're very a stickler for the terminology, is that we refer to both options and scenarios. And so I use the phrasing in terms of options are the choices that the government gets to make at this point. And so when it comes to ratifying, you get to choose a base case, which is no change, so not ratifying. And then there would be an option such as ratifying with no exemptions or anything like that. And then there'd be possibly a ratification with exemptions as a third option. Scenarios are really important because when you're looking at longer term reforms, such as what's the impact of the convention on various industries, then it's very important to think about what that industry would look like, whether we ratify or not. And so some of the things are, some of the industries that were impacted are things like coal-fired power stations, gold processing, but particularly gold roasting, which isn't a particularly common process, but it is used where to remove some of the chemicals that slow down or can absorb a whole lot of the reactants in later phases. And so what you need to do in the scenarios is look at, well, how many coal-fired power stations do you think we would have, whether we ratify or not? And clearly you could have a high number or a medium number or a low, high estimate and a medium number and a low estimate. And you can speak to the industry, but also industry experts and that sort of thing about how many gold roasting facilities do you think we would need, high, medium or low estimates, and how many new coal-fired power stations do you think we would need, high, medium and low estimates. So we think of those as scenarios. And so they're external factors, but they're really important. What you end up with when you group the scenarios together is a detailed version of sensitivity analysis. But we're very careful to use those terms in those sorts of ways. So when we talk about cost-benefit analysis, we look at the phrase that gets used is a triple bottom line, and the analysis for a cost-benefit analysis considers all the three elements of a triple bottom line. So there is the financial, the environmental benefits, and also the social and community costs and benefits. And there are particularly some overlaps between environmental and social and community. So financial costs and benefits are things such as industry compliance costs, which can increase or decrease, government enforcement costs, which could increase or decrease. And clearly, if they actually decrease under one of the options, then that's an avoided cost, which is a form of benefit. Environmental costs and benefits are some examples of things such as reduced air pollution or water pollution, reduced litter from things such as container deposit schemes or various other waste management processes will often result in less litter. Reduce or changes into the level of habitat loss, and things such as carbon dioxide. So CO2e is the phrase that gets used for carbon emissions. It's CO2 equivalents. So things like methane are counted as a multiple because they have in terms of CO2 equivalents. Social and community, there's two broad groups. One of them is the bottom one is about uses of environmental assets. And so whether they are traditional owners who cultural and religious values around some environmental assets, but also the standard the rest of the community as well in terms of uses of beaches and rivers and things like that. And if you find a higher value, so if they get cleaner, then you can go from it being just pretty to look at to you could actually swim in the river or fish from it, or those sorts of things. As the cleaner, the values go up and people get more use from it. There's also things such as health impacts and risks of premature death, and you can see there's an overlap between pollution and health impacts. So Minamata was around the reduction of mercury, and there's two broad health impacts that we identified through the research, and one of them is around the impact of mercury on IQ, particularly when children are exposed, but there's also the impact on heart difficulties for people as they get older. So then you get into things such as the statistical value of a life, quality affected life years, and disability affected life years. And those are things that you can look at. We also have done previously work on asbestos, and those sorts of clearly asbestos related diseases can result in premature death, but also can result in long-term cancer impacts and that sort of thing, even if you don't die younger or for a number of years before the victim dies. So when we set up cost-benefit analysis, we always set it out in terms of when we're looking at a particular option. So let's say this is option 1 compared to the base case. We focus on the marginal cost. So this is the changes in costs and benefits. And we always break them out in terms of which group is it going to fall to. And so state and territory, so territory government or the Commonwealth government, depending on who the group doing the reforms are, industry, and they can be changeover costs when the reforms are implemented, which are often capital expenditure if it's things like pollution control, but then ongoing costs around operating maintenance, but also reporting. Sometimes there are other stakeholders, but down the bottom we have the broader community and the environment generally. And so what we have there is some examples of costs and also examples of benefits. You can see we've put a box around the benefits for broader community and environment, and these are the ones that government focus on, particularly through some of their reforms. These are classically what people refer to as market failures, where if the government is able to make a change and reduce, let's say, pollution levels or something, mercury emission levels, then it can result in benefits to the broader community and also to the broader environment. Keep going. So getting buy-in on health and environmental benefits. So the top part just refers to exactly what we're just talking about in terms of market failure, and the environmental benefits and the health benefits are really important. Unfortunately, there is a natural element that some health and environmental benefits are, even if the dollar values that people were able to produce are quite high, the decision makers and community more broadly don't always necessarily agree entirely. And so a classic example is north of Perth, there is a whole lot of Bankshire woodlands. And the Bankshire woodlands, from a biodiversity point of view, and if you speak to any botanist or zoologist, are some of the most important natural environment that we have in the southwest of Western Australia. However, by the end of summer, it tends to look it's fairly low scrubby. It's about 6 to 8 foot tall often, and by the end of summer it looks really dry and looks nearly dead. Whereas and so the general broader community often don't value those sorts of things as highly as things such as jarrah forests or other elements. Whereas the experts will focus very heavily on the biodiversity values. The other one is health, and so through the Minamata analysis, as I said early on, a lot of our focus was on IQ impacts, and they were particularly for children who have exposed to a high fish diet, and that's often related to particular ethnic communities who have used to traditionally have had a relied heavily on fish. And so some Southeast Asian and some islander communities have relied very heavily on fish. The reality is that those groups are not well represented in Parliament, whereas we did the last analysis on Minamata, we identified that heart impacts in middle-aged men are a significant issue as well. And that's because there have been new research at a university level and have moved forwards there. And that reality is middle-aged men are much more of the people who you'll actually see in Parliament, in the parliamentary offices and that sort of thing. And so it's relatable that there's a risk to themselves, there's a risk to their friends, there's a risk to people they would know. Whereas the other communities, it's not the way it should be, but there is a pragmatism to it that is unfortunate. So the risk progression and considerations as to how to get your risk to progress to the next level and actually get your reforms implemented. All right, so we talk about 3 considerations that may assist reforms to progress. One of them is around more tests than a cost benefit. Secondly, is around transitional issues. And the third is a business case for reform. And the reality is that a lot of we do a whole lot of RISs and analysis on reforms that don't go ahead or don't go ahead at the time frame that the opponents would like. And this is ways that we can think about getting a higher success rate. So one of them is that cost-benefit analysis is a key tool, and it's the one that the economists focus on. However, it's not the only tool that people actually consider. So what we have on the right-hand side is referred to as the strategic triangle, and this does actually appear in the South Australian RIS guidance. This is where I actually learned it from, but it's also part of the ANZOG processes that they teach a unit that includes a discussion around the strategic triangle. And what you basically have is that any good reform should have general community support across the stakeholder groups. And so that's legitimacy and support. It should deliver a public value, so a positive cost-benefit analysis, or benefit-cost ratio greater than 1, and is technically feasible and enforceable within existing or achievable technology and organisational capacity. I have seen reports from Law Reform Commission type groups which have come up with things that would deliver a public value and would be supported by the community, but are basically unenforceable. And that makes life very difficult for the regulator. And often you're better off trying to considering whether that's the best way forwards. So the second one we have is transitional issues. And this is when we have a proposed reform, often we focus on where we are at the moment, the no change, and what the final reform would look like. What we don't consider is how do we get from where we are to, how do we implement that and how do we do it effectively? And so 2 things that we need that can help with transitional issues. Well, first of all, transitional issues are often bigger than people expect they're going to be. People imagine they're going to be reasonably small, whereas they end up being quite substantial, take a lot of time, and can actually cause reforms to stall. Even if people agree that what the end should look like, there is often a sort of it could be a stumbling block. And so one of the key things to do is consider and consult on transitional arrangements early. So particularly most RISs go through a consultation RIS and a decision RIS, and make sure that through the consultation phase and then the decision phase, you actually get groups, all the stakeholder groups who are consulted, to actually think about, well, how would we actually get to that if we were to do this? What's the right time frame? Those sorts of things. The other thing is that slow and steady wins the race is a fairly good truism. And it's worth considering that sometimes if we slow down the process and go with a longer lead time before you have full implementation, that gives industry time to plan for it. And so container deposit schemes were a classic where they have been announced in each state and territory, so New South Wales, ACT, Western Australia, but there was a lead time before they were actually commenced. And in Western Australia, because COVID hit, then the original planned implementation date was, I think, June 2020, and they did that. Look, it's better that we just delay it. And that reduces industry costs, it reduces industry angst, and can therefore remove groups who are sort of working or complaining or working against the reform occurring. Third one is a fairly broad statement, which is that the RIS is fundamentally a business case for reform. And so it should contain many of the same sort of elements of it as a business case, which is, this is the problem, this is we've identified a range of possible solutions, this is the one that we are going with. But you can go further than that. And so when you look at how business cases are promoted and the advice and the guidance that goes with business cases, so the Victorian guidance for business cases actually makes comments like, identify who the key decision makers are that need to be convinced and go and work with them. And that's a really useful piece of advice that can work with RISs as well. So focus the benefits onto the key decision makers. We talked about health benefits, heart impacts for middle-aged men as compared to ethnic communities. And as we said, it's not necessarily the way it should be, but it is the way that decision makers often will work. So recruiting allies is one of those other elements. So if you think back to the strategic triangle, it links back to that in terms of broad support. But if there is budgetary benefits from reform, then Treasury will often be your friend and your ally. Similarly, alignment with government objectives and election commitments is one of those bits that people will need to focus on very heavily. The government has made these commitments around the following points, or has the following stated objectives that have been written up, and this will align with those. And that way you can show that it's going to link very strongly with those and therefore provide a broader benefit that the government can see. Last one is removing or reducing opposition to reform. And what my note below is that often the way that it's done in the past was that the public servants would provide the frank and fearless advice and pass it on to the minister's office, and then they go out and consult with the opposition parties or those sorts of things. The reality is that the need for consultation means that you can actually go out and speak with those groups. So if you're doing environmental reforms around land clearing, which was one of the last things I worked on in government many years ago, then you're required to go out and speak to the Farmers Federation, the Pastoralists and Graziers Associations, those key parties, those key stakeholder groups. And that means that when when it actually gets to the minister's office and the National Party are looking at it, then their key stakeholder groups have already been consulted with, and you've been able to focus on what were the key concerns they had, and hopefully ameliorate those concerns and work with them that way. So that is the substantive parts of the talk. So we have a quick slide that talks about Marsden Jacob as to who we are and where we're working. And we also have the next talk that will be, as I said, in early August. And it will be given by Cameron O'Reilly, who's going to talk about the UK and European energy market price spikes and disruptions and what Australia can learn from that. Clearly, it's a highly topical talk.